The Horse Race is brought to you by Benchmark Strategies, Boston's leading public affairs and public relations consulting firm. To learn more, connect with Benchmark on LinkedIn at Benchmark Strategies or visit benchmark-strategies.com.
Welcome back to The Horse Race, your weekly look at politics, policy, and elections in Massachusetts. I'm Jennifer Smith, reporter for Commonwealth Beacon, and it's Thursday, November 13th. Today we are talking about the politics of the shutdown's conclusion and what's been going on with New England courts during Trump 2.0. Steve Koczela, president of the Massing Polling Group, I am looking at your human face.
You are in the flesh, not
in the
on
bunker.
Zoom. Not on one of those little boxes.
That's true. I do realize that I have stumbled into the problem that if an AI were to hear me say that, whether or not you were here in the bunker or on Zoom would not be clarified by I am looking at your human face.
AI does have trouble with those things. But yes, it is true. It is I. I am here. I have arrived. I'm back for a couple weeks, and we're sitting in the ye old podcast bunker recording this face-to-face.
I really have to ask, after all of your time with, I can only assume, superior wildlife, how is the November Boston wildlife treating you? Is it inspiring?
Well, a couple days ago, we went out in a park in outside of Nairobi and saw giraffes and saw warthogs and saw, zebras and gazelles and everything. And since I've come back, I've seen squirrels and chipmunks and a story about an alligator in the Charles. So I feel like I haven't actually seen the wildlife, but somebody does need to explain to me the alligator in the Charles story because I have many questions.
Yeah, I also have questions. I would just like to say that you have so far avoided the roving bands of Boston turkeys then, apparently.
Yes, that's true, actually. I have seen a couple turkeys. Not many, but a couple turkeys also.
They didn't make moves on you?
Are they have them like out on the common now? Like, are they fully downtown turkeys?
Yeah, but I mean, my favorite was an extremely bold pack the other day when I was leaving Dorchester and heading downtown. The absolutely infamous Kosciuszko Circle Rotary, basically right at the top of Morrissey Boulevard, like the most deadly, evil, don't cross this thing rotary. And in the middle, 3 very brave turkeys just hanging out, looking for their next victims to mob.
Amazing.
I don't know. No, it was great. I was thinking about you and wildlife because I was recalling the beauty of entering kind of a new place and discovering the joy of nature anew, the way that the Boston Globe did when it moved downtown.
Yeah, that's right. Oh my gosh.
That was so great.
Precious in a way.
It was. So I pulled it up, by the way, because this was in 2017, and the actual title of this article was "Rabbits Are Hopping All Over," and there's just a little picture of a bunny, and there's a quote just, "It seems like there's always a bunny around," says this person. And this person also insists she is no longer surprised when she stumbles upon one.
Yeah, there was a lot of when they moved downtown from Dorchester, which was, for those who haven't been listening to our podcast from the beginning, quite a while ago now, it was like they just discovered things like, look, Beacon Hill, animals live here. Look, transit, people ride it, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So anyway, they've been here for a while now. They've become accustomed to the falcons, accustomed to the bunnies, accustomed to the other animals that live in and around the State House. I guess around the State House, not so much in the State House.
I don't know. Are you saying something mean about our lawmakers now that you're far enough away?
I retract and apologize. But anyway, we have a lot to talk about today because among many other news stories today, we've got the Epstein files, which we're not talking about today. Maybe we will next week. But it also looks like the shutdown may be ending. And there's both why it's ending to talk about and then what Massachusetts politicos are saying about it. So where should we start?
I think probably noting, as we usually do, that we record these on Wednesday. So right now it's, to be very exact, 2:21 p.m. on the Wednesday. And we say that because later today, in a few hours, there is expected to be a final vote on the shutdown ending resolution that the Senate passed, but in the House. So basically, all of the House members have been called back into Washington after 8 Democrats basically kind of defected from the bulk of the party to vote to put forward an agreement that would end the shutdown with a few provisions that we'll get into in specific terms. But we assume by the time you hear this, the House has voted to pass, probably narrowly, this resolution that will fund several parts of the government for at least through January.
That's the best we can hope for these days. But I do have to ask, because we talked last week a lot about Democrats winning everything in the elections, and they came out of them apparently, potentially super strong. You know, they won all of the ones that could have potentially been competitive. They won in purple places. They won in sort of light pinkish places. And then here we are. And we're in a place where it seemed like the Democrats got nothing, really. Like, what happened?
Yeah, I've sort of been kind of noodling around on this a bit, where I was trying to see what kind of the briefest way would be to explain this. So when the shutdown started, so before October 1st, when everything, they turned off the money spigot, the reason that we headed into the shutdown was, as we talked with my colleague Chris Lisinski about last month, because the Democrats were specifically looking for an extension to this healthcare subsidies tax credit deal, which basically made it easier in a way it hadn't been before for not just lower income people, but also middle income people to afford health plans off of the Affordable Care Act. Basically, through that kind of connector program, it has led to mass enrollment through the Mass Health Connector. It's basically led to a really, really big boost in how many people can be covered by health insurance. And so those were set to expire at the end of the year because they were tied to the pandemic. And Democrats wanted to see those extended. Republicans did not. And this is how we basically walked into the shutdown. So that's where we started, right? We had expiring tax credits and a shutdown potentially happening. Now, this agreement that has been reached funds almost everything through the end of January, but then specifically has full year funding for SNAP benefits, veterans benefits, and the legislature, and also would reverse the basically downsizing of the federal workforce that occurred during the federal shutdown, kind of because of the shutdown. So the major things that happened over the last month have been this big fight over the Trump administration trying to cancel or claw back SNAP food stamp benefits, and also the Trump administration trying to reduce the federal workforce through this. So the agreement, if I am recalling it correctly, is essentially that there are no tax credit extensions. And there is an agreement to undo the things that happened during the shutdown. So Democrats are essentially ending this with an agreement from the Senate to have a vote on the tax credits, no agreement from the House, and kind of a right sizing of the stuff that happened during the shutdown. So I'm trying to figure out how much is different before and after?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And I should also just pause here and give a shout out to a fantastic Codcast episode, our sister podcast from Commonwealth Beacon, about the tax credits and where they came from and what they do and how much they are and what it means for Massachusetts and all those kinds of things. So I think it's maybe last week or the week before. You can find it easily just by going to their feed. But if Jen's description, you want like half an hour more of detail on all that, then definitely go check that out. Getting back to your excellent analysis, I couldn't agree more. It's like we went through this entire thing and we're right back where we were, except we have a pinky promise that we're going to have this nice little vote at some point, or some of us will and some of us won't. So it does, I think, to me at least, call into question, what are you doing with all the political capital that voters literally gave you like less than a week ago, or maybe about a week ago by the time people are listening to this? Like, what was the point of all of that if then you're going to turn around and fold like a paper bag and get nothing out of it, is what it seems.
Now, Steve, you're very much in line right now with the entire Massachusetts delegation because, our two senators, Ed Markey and Elizabeth Warren, both said that this was basically a disaster vote. They both voted against accepting this. Just to read a few of the things that they noted here. Warren said, "I will not support a deal that does nothing to make healthcare more affordable. The fight to lower costs is a righteous fight, and we must not give it up." And then, of course, noting sort of this kind of threat that was hanging over the entire thing here. She also noted, again quoting, "Donald Trump has made clear he is willing to hurt people, hungry children, federal employees, working families in order to get his way." So a lot of the terminology from the Democrats has kind of been like that this was a hostage situation sort of feeling. Markey also kind of had a similar sense there, noting something that might sound pretty familiar to those who have been following Commonwealth Beacon coverage on this, which is that the health insurance time bomb, this is, quote, "coupled with deep cuts to Medicaid, will also be a brutal 1-2 punch that devastates community hospitals throughout the United States." So Massachusetts is right now in a really, really precarious position in terms of how it's going to be financing its healthcare system. So that's kind of how the senators who did not vote for it were already talking about it.
Right, and of course, it didn't stop at the senators. We also have statements from Ayanna Pressley, Jim McGovern, Seth Moulton. There's probably actually statements from all of them. Just these are the ones that happen to be linked and noted on the specific news story on GBH that I'm looking at. But yeah, I don't think anybody and none of the delegation that I've seen or heard from are jazzed about the way that this deal worked out.
Right. And this is also where I would note that as we talk about every once in a while, there's a pretty wide spread in the Massachusetts delegation in terms of kind of how lefty, how centrist, how whatever version of Democrat there is in fact usually represented inside our delegation. But they've been pretty much in lockstep on this one in a way that the Senate Democrats have not been. And we, of course, should probably note there is plenty of kind of speculation or rumors or kind of hypothesizing that even though Senator Schumer, so of course the head of the Democrats in the Senate, voted against this himself, there were 8 Democrats who decided to vote for this resolution, and conveniently or mysteriously, a lot of them were not planning on seeking office again in the future. So the question of whether or not this was kind of like a sacrifice vote to move this ball down the field is a big and interesting one. And can I ask, Steve, because you noted, of course, not just the kind of glow from the elections the Democrats have been talking about, basically, but this is a podcast where we talk about polling. And the question of, what does or doesn't inspire confidence in politicians is not just their own personal polling to get as many peepops in for our poor producer as possible, but also the polling on the opposing party, so the president here. Like, is Donald Trump someone that they're looking at his polling and going, oh no, this man is beloved, we should be very afraid of pissing him off, or no?
No. I mean, I think it's more, if there's a possible explanation, maybe to stick with the hostage metaphor, that like they have seen that he's more than willing to shoot all the hostages, and like claw back food money from poor people. Like that's where we were. That's where the dialogue was, is like, can we actually get back the money that we gave to poor and struggling families and make them send it back to us? That's like where we had arrived. So, certainly it's not high polling numbers. We're seeing, depending on the poll, 36, 37% approval ratings, kind of in that range. Overall, we're seeing approval numbers on specific things like handling the federal government, 33% from a recent NORC poll. Handling the economy, also 33. Healthcare, 34. Immigration, 42. So terrible numbers across the board. So it's definitely not, there's this super popular president and we dare not oppose him. There's other explanations, but it's definitely not, expression or reaction to political strength reflected in Donald Trump's poll numbers.
In Massachusetts, of course, we don't have any Republicans at the state or federal level. Not that there are no state elected Republicans, but they aren't the heads of our state here. But Republicans in the Senate are kind of using the same hostage language as the Democrats are, basically saying, well, the Democrats were holding the government hostage to get these tax credits, a lot of objection about kind of the level of government spending here. So is there any relevant polling about, at this point, now that it looks like the shutdown is going to conclude in sort of the same way that it started, how people are feeling about the Democrats as a party versus the Republicans as a party, because they're tied to Trump, but it's not a one-to-one.
The shutdown itself isn't really far enough in the rearview mirror to know how they're going to react to that. I think we need to kind of give this a couple more weeks, and some of it will have to do with things like how the media frames it. It'll have to do with, how things restart, what happens next. I mean, we're now in a familiar situation since Trump has been president where the shutdown is like 1,200 years ago, even though it hasn't even stopped yet. But we've already got Epstein files coming out 10,000 at a time just today. So if there's a vote today and tomorrow 50,000 pages of emails and all kinds of other stuff comes out, then it'll be what shutdown? Like, that was so long ago. Does anybody even remember that anymore? Like, look at these emails about all these famous people, going on Epstein's plane and everything like that. So that is another possibility.
It does sort of remind me when you say something like that, that I think since the first Trump term and then through the pandemic, the joke / not joke was that, every day feels like 100 years and 100 years feels like just a minute went by. So I think that is a very excellent point, and I would love to conclude this segment with a sort of meta question, which is, has it made polling harder during this last decade where, like, you're kind of assuming voters are very overwhelmed or paying attention to the next thing, or are some things way more enduring than we kind of in the media class think they are?
Yeah, that's a interesting topic, because one thing that used to be true was when I started this back in the late Bronze Age, you would try to do your polling kind of between big news items, and it'd be like, okay, well, the State of the Union is on such a date, so we're going to do it for the 4 days before that, because nothing's going to happen. There's no news those days, and then we'll see after that, we'll do another poll and see like what changed. And now it's like, there are 25 stories that in previous generations would have ended presidencies and caused, members of Congress and senators to be run out of town on a rail. And now there's dozens of them at least per week, if not per day. So in a way, that's just meant that you don't really wait anymore. You don't try to game it out and think, okay, well, so-and-so's campaign announcement is next Wednesday, so we're going to do this before that. Because you just can't, there's never a time when there's not tons of kind of huge news stories happening. It also does mean that everyone's, the noise in everybody's ears is just so loud and so continuous now that it can be hard to kind of parse like what people are reacting to, because there's just so much. It's not possible to like create a big enough like intake stream to be able to keep track of everything that's going on.
Yeah. Well, we're going to take a little pivot away from at least one of these branches, which is the legislature, and head on over to, the big shiny courthouses and talk about how the judiciary has been doing this entire time. Steve, how's that sound?
See, I'm appreciating your like physical transportation of listeners, which you made
Yes.
fun of me for last week. So we're going to leave the hallowed halls of Capitol Hill and we're going to march down the mall and end up in front of the Supreme Court building.
I would like to note I didn't give anyone any physical directions. You did. I simply noted that we were moving from one conceptual, metaphysical space to another. So let's do that.
Let's do that. And now we're going to come back to our never-ending series that's been going on literally since Jen Smith joined this podcast, and we have tentatively titled it, What the Heck Has Been Going On with the Courts? I know it's a long title, but it is very descriptive, and it does get at the question that Jen has been asking both me, for which I have no answers, and herself, and she has many answers, pretty much since we started this podcast. So the big question recently has been one of kind of regionalism. Like, where do you go if you want to do various things within the court system? So let's start there, Jen. What is the topic that we're talking about with this question?
Right. So One of the funniest things for me, aside from if I write the words forum shopping into the script, they get immediately knocked out by Steve. But I think forum shopping is pretty interesting here. So, the easy human way to talk about this is that federal judges in some areas tend to get a lot more of certain types of cases than judges in other areas. And in this case, what we're talking about is judges in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and Maine, who have basically become like a sort of central location to bring legal challenges to the Trump administration's policies. They have been getting tons of these. And we've been thinking about doing something on this topic here since about 2 weeks into the shutdown, when Reuters actually took a look at just how many lawsuits are hitting the New England federal courts. So that's why we're thinking about this right now, but it's been a long-standing kind of fascination of mine when you're suddenly like, why is the only court I hear about these days about one courthouse out of Boston that just keeps saying the Trump administration can't do this, and then it just gets knocked down when it gets up to the Supreme Court level? So we wanted to talk a little bit about why this just keeps happening. Why are things bubbling out of New England?
So is it more or less that in more conservative parts of the country, you would go if you wanted to do something that would match with conservative views, and if you want to do something that leans in the other direction, you'd come to a blue region like New England? Is that more or less the idea?
Absolutely. There's one district in Texas, the 5th District, that has become sort of infamous for where kind of the opposite thing happens, which is conservatives who are looking for a very specific outcome on a number of social issues would go to that court because it tends to rule in this kind of predictable way. And so looking at whether or not it's a great thing that these courts have sort of become associated with a certain type of partisan politics, in some ways, it makes it more predictable. You kind of know what you're getting when you're going to these courts. But then on the other side, courts kind of ask the public to treat them as sort of an objective balls and strikes sort of system. So that's why we were looking at this to begin with. And then, of course, the shutdown happened.
Okay, so then I love numbers, and I imagine there have to be numbers here. There have to be numbers on why you would go to New England or why you would go to to Texas if you had a certain kind of lawsuit. So how much of a sure thing is it?
I mean, it is as close to a sure thing as you can kind of get in the legal system. So when Reuters initially started doing this analysis, there had been about 72 lawsuits brought in those kind of 4 New England states. And those are being brought by attorneys general, advocacy groups, and institutions targeted by the administration. So, folks who were upset about what the Department of Housing and Urban Development were doing would, for instance, bring these into those courts. So 72 at the time. Now we're at around 80. So it's a lot of lawsuits just oriented toward Trump in these areas. And when Reuters did its initial look of the 51 cases where rulings have been issued so far, 46 of them declared that the Trump administration was on the wrong side of it. That's gone up since then in some of these cases around SNAP and food stamps policies as well. So the lower courts in New England are pretty consistently saying, we do not think that the Trump administration is right in its claims about birthright citizenship reclassification, cutting grants in terms of education and research funding, food stamps, all of these kinds of problems. Those have been funneled through these courts, and the lower courts are pretty consistently siding with the people bringing the challenges.
And it feels like that kind of goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, too, where, the Supreme Court is very infamously basically 6-3 right now, and ruling after ruling after ruling is 6-3, or just done, in the shadow docket with no explanation whatsoever. So it feels like you can get what you want in Massachusetts or Texas, but if it goes to the Supreme Court, basically the same thing happens in the other direction, which is they're going to rule with the Trump administration. Almost always. There's a case, of course, right now about tariffs where maybe they won't, but in the vast majority of cases that we've seen so far, they've kind of let Trump do whatever he wants.
It's also been in a sort of interesting way. So one thing, and this comes up when you and I were talking on the podcast a little while ago about the rulings around whether or not you can racially profile in making immigration-related arrests. The High Court didn't say, yes, this is actually fine. We have ruled that, racial profiling is totally kosher policy. But they said basically that they're okay putting that ruling from the lower courts on hold while the merits get worked out at the lower level. So functionally, as we're seeing in the case with SNAP benefits right now, they are ruling in the way that the Trump administration would like without needing to take kind of a strong subject matter stand on it. So eventually these cases might make it back up to the Supreme Court on the merits, but for now, they kind of get to have it both ways.
And the follow-up question to that, I suppose, is that means that should there be a Democratic president next, they can just undo whatever pieces of that they might want that might benefit what a Democratic president is trying to do.
Yeah, so this has been really interesting. If anyone has been listening to the tariff cases arguments or reading any analysis there, one of the funnier things to me is that in considering whether or not a president can just declare an emergency and then put tariffs in place, feels a little weird if you think about what happens if it's not your preferred president doing it. So let's say that you're in favor with the way that Trump is kind of assigning tariffs here, if you think that the way that other countries have been, to use his word, treating us very unfairly, and you can put in reciprocal tariffs, and you think that's fine. The thing that got brought up at the Supreme Court level is, well, what if another president says the climate emergency is really, really serious and I'd like to place 50% tariffs on any kind of gas-powered car? Could they do that? And so that came up in those arguments, and the position of the Trump administration, the federal government, is like, yeah, probably. So I am curious to see how that ends up kind of filtering its way through, this understanding that if the court greenlights partisan action tied to executive power, that can cut either way, and they don't always love doing that.
Yeah. Okay, well, there's obviously much, much more to come on this question. I do have to ask, though, a more practical question that I know you've spent a lot of time on recently, which is who is actually at work right now in federal courthouses? Because there's been a lot of discussion about like FAA and air traffic controllers and like SNAP benefits and so forth, but presumably these 80 or so cases in Massachusetts must have somebody there filing the papers and typing the things and turning the lights on, right?
I wish that was a really easy question to answer, because initially my thinking was, well, we know that these kind of federal furloughs, we know that, essential employees essentially being asked to work without pay is affecting almost any agency right now. Basically, every area of the federal government is like, well, if you have to be working to keep the government running, to keep society rolling, to keep planes in the air, then you need to be at work whether or not you're being paid. But the question of how this would end up hitting the courts was a little bit of a mystery, because the courts, like some other institutions, kind of had some, to stay with the aviation metaphor, a little bit of runway. They had accounts that were had some money in them that were kind of generated through court fees. So for the first few weeks of the shutdown, they were kind of able to operate normally. But what was sort of hanging in the background was, when that money runs out, I mean, justice can't just stop, right? Especially because of all of these lawsuits that are being brought through all of these courts. And so what happened when the federal judiciary announced on October 20th that the money was out, they were not going to have the finances to support normal operations, they also followed up with, and all of these individual districts can kind of figure out what that looks like for them. We saw a few different things, and Massachusetts, oddly, has been one of the hardest to figure out.
Okay, that is a mystery to me, because presumably when you call over there and say, okay, well, who's actually at their desk right now, they tell you, well, in fact, 30% of the people are not currently at their desk. But you're saying that's not the response
I'm watching
you're
you make the same face that I've made over the phone for the past 3 weeks, which is, when I ask the District of Massachusetts, and bear in mind, of course, that Freedom of Information Act, public records requests, that sort of thing, like those don't apply to the federal court systems. You can ask them what their policies are, and, if there's a standing order, like if a judge has declared something, that's, of course, public. But in terms of the staffing levels, I asked, hey, how much money did you have and when did it run out? And they go, I can't tell you that. And then you say, well, have there been any...
Wait, but why? Why can't... Is this
they
just like
decline
obstinance?
to. They just decline. They just don't want to. They say I cannot, and that's the thing. And then you ask, well, how much of the staff is still working? And they say, can't tell you that. And I go, well, you say in these announcements and these orders that the District of Massachusetts is operating normally. What does that mean? And they say, I can't tell you that. And then you say, well, we understand that kind of essential constitutional matters have to work their way through here. Has there been any change to caseload or processing? We can't tell you that. And I would like to say that Massachusetts is not in line right now with some of its neighbors. In Connecticut, they made a very clear announcement with standing order that everyone is kind of considered an essential employee, but not everyone needs to be in every day. So the clerks aren't working Fridays there. And then in Rhode Island, they went to a 4-day week. And again, there was an official judicial announcement. But Massachusetts has kind of been this weird black box, with the one exception being that the bankruptcy court out of the U.S. District of Massachusetts said, our policy is basically anything in which the United States is a party, whether they're suing or they're being sued. Our default is those are going to be stayed. Those are going to be delayed cases until this funding thing is resolved, we assume. And I asked the AG's office about this, and they said, yeah, we kind of are dealing with this on a case-by-case basis. The government asks that these cases be delayed because, of course, the DOJ is also working without pay. And then the AGs have to go, guys, this is really important. We would like you to proceed with this. And so the AG's office says the courts have generally been unwilling to delay a case that has like a serious and immediate need, like the SNAP case. But I don't know if you thought it was going to be just calling the District of Massachusetts and saying, have you fired anyone? And they would say yes or no. Mm-mm.
Well, I can't even with this. And apparently neither can the courts. They also can't even with this.
They don't want to. They can't, and you can't make them.
You can't make them. All right. Well, we have something great for the outro, so let's get to that. We'll be right back.
I'm Zainab Asma-Doyle, Research Director at the Massing Polling Group. The Massing Polling Group serves the region's leading foundations, political groups, government entities, and businesses. Our surveys and focus groups bring high-quality data to the toughest questions facing society today. Learn more at massingpolling.com.
And that brings us to our final segment, which this week is brought to you by our horse department here at the horse race, which we may need to rename as the Donkeys of Exceptional Cuteness department here at the horse race. Steve, I loved that phrase, but why did I say it?
That is a good question. You said it because you're enthusiastic about Donkeys of Exceptional Cuteness. But what has happened is that apparently there was an event November 6th to 9th at the Big E out in Western Mass where thousands of people came together basically to celebrate all things about horses. Horse demonstrations, horseback rides, interactive events, shopping, adoption events, and Donkeys of Exceptional Cuteness apparently was also a thing that happened there.
I'm really, really sad as a big musical theater person myself to have missed apparently a musical celebration of the horse.
That is amazing. And also, I have to say that they called it the, quote, Donkey Extravaganza, capital D, capital E, an actual proper name for this donkey-related event. So we've decided, I'm announcing right here on the air, that next year we are going to do a live podcast from the Horse Extravaganza at the Big E.
I think that's incredible. I loved our live podcast at the horse races so much. I am not sure how effectively we can find the outlines of a donkey of exceptional cuteness, but we can do our best.
We are going to do our best. So mark your calendars. Cancel your previous engagements if you have any for early November of next year.
Cancel your actual plans to get engaged to your partner if you feel like it. All engagements are off. We are going to look at the horses.
Yep, we're going to the Big E. So let's do it.
We're running.
Giddy up. All right. Well, unfortunately for all of you, or perhaps fortunately, depending on how you see it, that is all the time we have for today. I'm Steve Kazella, signing off with Jennifer Smith. Our two-part production team this week is the great John Gee and Charlie Kazella, who also makes our music. You can write to us at thehorseracepodcast@gmail.com. Don't forget to give The Horse Racer a review wherever you're hearing us now. Subscribe to Commonwealth Beacon's daily download and reach out to us here at the Massing Polling Group if you need polls or focus groups done. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next week.